Good evening, everybody. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to our next episode of Sages from the Ages, presented by Rabbi Rashi Simon. Just a quick reminder, if people want to remain on mute, but feel free at any time to unmute yourself to ask a question, and there should be time at the end as well. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Rabbi Simon.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil, for your tech support as always, which is essential in view of my technological limitations. Right, so we are back for our next installment in our Sages of the Ages series. We're concentrating on the 16th century. For those who've been with us, or even if you haven't, we have done Don Isaac Abarbanel. We did the week after that Rabbi Ovadia Saforno from Italy. Last week we did Rabbi Moshe Al-Sheikh, who lived most of his life, the most important years of his life, we can say, in Tzfat. And today we're going to talk about the famous Ari. He was a contemporary of Rabbi Moshe Al-Sheikh, and we'll see actually how they had some associations also. So we've got here at the top of the page, I'm sure you can see it if you're looking at your screen, Sages of the Ages, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria Ashkenazi, known today universally as Ari, or as we shall see some variations on that name. So how does a name like Rabbi Yitzchak Luria Ashkenazi, how does that become Ari? So first let's talk about the derivation of the acronym. And by the way, that's a photograph of his kever in the famous cemetery in Tzfat. Perhaps you have been there. So the derivation of the acronym, they say today that Ari stands for Eloki Rabbeinu Yitzchak, the godly Rabbeinu Yitzchak. It's very possible that it began as Ashkenazi, Rabbi Yitzchak. His name was Luria Ashkenazi. His father's name was Luria. His father's surname was Luria. His father was called Shlomo Luria. And his father was Ashkenazi. And therefore, because the father, lived among Sephardim, he became known as Ashkenazi because they were all Sephardim for the most part. So he became known as Ashkenazi. But obviously, Ashkenazi is a very general designation. And actually, the Luria part may indicate the family originated in Alsace-Lorraine. That's the Luria part, possibly difficult to know for sure. We know that Luria was a not uncommon, even remains today, not an uncommon Jewish surname, including great rabbis with that surname. Probably the greatest of them is Rabbi Shlomo Luria, known as Maharshal. There's also David Luria and others. It's been suggested perhaps the families were related. There's no proof for that, and it's very difficult to know for sure. It's also very possible, I would say even likely, that the name Ari, the designation Ari, and we also find Ariel. Ariel would mean the Lion of God, but it may derive from Hariel, that his name was Hariel, or the acronym Harav Yitzchak Ashkenazi Luria. And that became Hariel, and over time the hay was dropped, as many people anyway. A soft hay can easily be obscured. So that's how he became known as Ariel. And of course, the Ari, the name Ari being the lion, the king, the lion is a symbol of the greatest, the most noble of the animals. And it's interesting, you've got it here in the outline, the holy lion, because he's known as Ari HaKadosh. I mentioned last week that the Al-Sheikh is one of the very few great sages among all of the great Torah personalities throughout the centuries. Only a very few are known with the kagonim, the appellation HaKadosh. Al-Sheikh HaKadosh, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, and of course Ari HaKadosh. So he's today known as Ari HaKadosh, or just for short Ari Zal. It's interesting to consider why he's called Ari Zal. Zal, of course, just means Zichron Levracha. I have my own theory. I haven't seen it written, but my own theory is that, as we shall see, the famous Ari, the famous Rabbeinu Yitzchak Luria, died at a shockingly young age. His renown spread over time quickly, and yet by the time word of his greatness reached, let's say, in Europe, etc., he may have been already in the next world. He may have been Zal already. So possibly for that reason, he became known as Rizal, and he's frequently known today by that sort of association. His students of whom there were a number of notable Talmidim, we'll speak about some of them, were known as the Gurei Ha'ari. A gur is like a young lion, a wolf. So the Gurei Ha'ari, and in fact, some of the Mefarshim quote teachings of the Ari, or that originate in the circle of the Ari, in the name of the Gurei Ha'ari, the lion cubs, so to speak. So it's interesting, and you've got it here on the number 2, the little designation 2, that the holy lion is our subject, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, and the Rambam is the great rationalist, is known as the eagle. So we have the Kabbalist who's known as the lion, and the rationalist who's known as the eagle, and both metaphors are found in the vision of Yechezkel, Ezekiel, in his vision of the Merkava, the chariot, the so-called vision of the chariot. In other words, these images, the lion and the eagle, were among the 4 images that he beheld in the divine throne that was surrounded by those images. And here are 2 of them. When we speak about the Ari, as we shall for the next 40 minutes or 50 minutes or so tonight, we find that fact and legend are inextricably intertwined. A person of such extraordinary stature, a person whose star blazed so bright, but for such a short period of time, inevitably is going to become I won't say shrouded in mystery, but his legacy is always going to be embellished with many legends. And in some cases, no doubt there is some truth, perhaps a lot of truth. In other cases, it's difficult to know. And certainly, as I say, fact and legend are intertwined. We're going to try to limit ourselves tonight to facts, although we may tell a couple of legends as well along the way, which help at the same time to give us a feeling, an appreciation, a picture, an aura for the greatness of a most extraordinary personality. He was born in, we'll get to the birth in one moment, but to disrupt to number 2, Rabbi Yitzchak ben Shlomo, Luria Ashkenazi. So his father is Ashkenazi. The Luria part we mentioned may indicate the family originated in Alsace-Lorraine. His mother was Sephardi. He was born in Jerusalem, but he left Jerusalem as a child. The background is quite interesting. He was born in 1534 in Jerusalem when it was under Ottoman rule. In fact, he lived all his life in the Ottoman Empire. He lived in Egypt, as we shall see as well. He lived his greatest years, of course, were in Sfat, which was part of the Syrian region of the Ottoman Empire. He was born, according to tradition, in a house which still stands to this very day. It's on Rehov Or HaChaim, and it's today the Old Yishuv Museum. If you have, we have all been to the Kotel. I'm sure everyone on this call has had occasion to visit the Kotel, perhaps many times, but I wonder if you have taken the chance to visit the Museum of the Old Yishuv. If you go to Yerushalayim, should be a time of peace and prosperity. It's Hashem b'mhera v'yameinu, and even the possibility of visiting Yerushalayim, which until quite recently we took pretty much for granted, it's also not so immediately accessible. But when you're next there, Mir Hashem b'shat tova, visit the Museum of the Old Yishuv. It's on Rehov Or HaChaim in the Jewish Quarter, Or HaChaim Sheish. It's an unprepossessing building, 500 years old or more possibly. That is the building that today houses this small but very worthwhile museum. And it was also the base medrash of the Or HaChaim, Rabbeinu Chaim ibn Attar, who lived in Yerushalayim at the end of his life. He died, I think, in 1743, about 200 years after the birth of the Ari. And the Or HaChaim, that was either his home or his base medrash. And that same building is where the father of the Arizal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, was learning late at night on one occasion, late into the night, and no one else was around. He was studying possibly books of the esoteric tradition, and he received a vision of Eliyahu Hanavi. Elijah the prophet appeared to him and said to him that his wife, told this Rabbi Shlomo Luria that his wife will conceive and will bear a son, and that this son will begin to redeem the generation from the klipot, from the husks of impurity, and he will enable a tikkun for the generation, and he will reveal secrets of the Torah that had not been discovered yet in the history of the Jewish people. And Eliyahu Hanavi told the father to be, that when the baby is born, I would like to be the sandik. So wait for me. I'm going to be the sandik. And he disappeared. So the rabbi went home, and he did not tell anyone, even his wife. He did not tell. Sure enough, his wife conceived, and when the baby was born, on the 8th day, he took the baby to the Beis Medrash for the bris, and of course, the guests and the family, friends, etc., were gathered, and they were ready to get underway, and he was delaying because he didn't see any sign of Eliyahu Hanavi. So they said, why don't we begin? He said, well, not all the guests have assembled. At any rate, according to the legend, he did then, Eliyahu Hanavi appeared to him. Eliyahu Hanavi told him, look, you be the Sadek, I'm going to sit on your lap. I'm going to hold the baby. And again, according to the legend, no one was able to perceive the presence of Eliyahu Hanavi, as the father of this infant boy served as the Sadek as the bris was accomplished. He named him Yitzchak. Sadly, his father, or I suppose it was sad at the time, but anyway, it was the destiny. He passed away. The father of a young Yitzchak Luria passed away within a few years, and his mother was therefore a widow, and she returned to Egypt, where she was from. She returned to Cairo. So the young Yitzchak Luria, whose talent was immediately apparent, was raised in the absence of a father. He was raised, you see here in number 3, raised by a wealthy uncle, Mordechai Francis, who later became his father-in-law. This Mordechai Francis was a wealthy, prominent member of the community. He was a tax farmer, and he immediately recognized the exceptional talent of this young child, and he sent him to learn with the leading rabbi of Cairo at the time, one of the greatest of the generation. I hope you've heard of him, Rabbi David ibn Abu Zimra, known as Radvaz. He was the Rav in Krakow. I hope you know, not Krakow, I'm sorry, Cairo. He was a Rav in Cairo. He wrote a commentary on the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah, also many tshuvas, a large number of responses which have been published. It's quoted very widely, very influential in halachic circles. So the young Yitzchak Luria studied under the Radvaz, and then under an older colleague, in other words, another Talmud of Radvaz, who was older than Yitzchak Luria, and that is Rabbi Betzalel Ashkenazi. Those who studied in yeshivas may have come across the name. I hope you have, because he is the author of Shita Mekubetzes. Shita Mekubetzes is a collection of, it's not really a collection because it's presented in a very compelling fashion, but a wide range of comments on the Talmud, on a number of important tractates of the Talmud. And so he studied, Yitzchak Luria studied under these two great Torah personalities, and of course their studies and the legacy of these great sages is in the area of Talmud, of halacha, of what I'm trying to say is the legal aspect of Torah, not the hidden, not the mystical, not the esoteric. And one of the points that I think is important to realize is that the Ari was a master of halacha, of Torah in the wider sense, in the revealed sense. It's true that his great eminence, and the reason we're having this shir devoted to the understanding the life and legacy of the Ari, is because of what he accomplished in the area of nistar, of the hidden, the esoteric aspect of Torah. But his greatness in the area of Talmudic law, etc., was unquestioned as well. It's interesting. According to the Chida, the Chida was a remarkable Torah personality who died in 1807, if I remember correctly. And he wrote voluminously, copiously, on a wide range of subjects. He was born in Hebron, he lived in Yerushalayim. He was sent, or he sent himself maybe, as an emissary to Europe on 2 different occasions. He traveled for years at a time, and he read manuscripts, and he published a book called Shem HaGedolim, which contains biographical sketches of a wide range of Torah personalities. So much of what we know about not just Ari, but many of the personalities, including Al-Sheikh and the others we've spoken about, derives actually from the writings of the Chida and many other sources as well. But Chida is one of those, he's one of those polymath personalities. He wrote a travel log. He spent time in London as well. He wrote Chida. I don't want to get carried away because he's one of my favorites. He wrote about halacha and about Kabbalah as well. So he mentions that the Ari collaborated with his mentor, Rabbi Ashkenazi, and together they wrote the Shita Mekubetzes on Masechta Zvachim. And if you haven't learned it or you haven't heard of it, there's a reason for that. I'm sorry to say that the manuscript perished in a fire in Izmir in 1735. So it was never published, and the manuscript was written, but it perished in that fire. So therefore, we don't have it. But he wrote, according to Chida, Ari wrote this commentary on the Masechta Zvachim, a very difficult tractate of the Talmud. Just mention one other interesting point here on the eminence of the Ari as a Talmudist, as a halachist. Rav Yosef Karo, we did not speak about him this series because we did it in the past at Ner Yisrael previously. Rabbi Yosef Karo, I'm sure you know, was the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the greatest halachic authority of his generation and maybe future generations as well. It is upon his foundation that all Jewish practice in halachic sense is built. The Ari was a contemporary of Rabbi Yosef Karo in Tzfat, and apparently the Ari addressed a question to Rabbi Yosef Karo, which is taken up in the responsa of Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch, wrote the Beis Yosef, wrote the Kesef Mishnah. He also wrote a tshuva collection called Avkas Rochel, a collection of responsa. One of those halachic inquiries was originated from the Ari, and Rabbi Yosef Karo responds to his inquiry. Now, for those who are familiar with the style of tshuvas, sometimes the question is is presented in a very straightforward way, but it's often the case that the questioner will write his own halachic almost discourse on the subject, proposing the different possibilities or maybe even arguing in favor of a certain conclusion, but he would like the input or like the imprimatur or maybe the refutation. He invites the comment and the clarification from the authority whom he is addressing. So the Ari evidently addresses, keep saying evidently because some have questioned whether the Ari would even need to write a question and ask somebody else, or whether even the Ari was involved in the halachic discourse. But many have suggested, and this is the view of the Chida, that it was indeed addressed to the Ari. And the reason he sought the clarification from his town's, his fellow member of the community in Tzfat, is that this was a question about charging interest on a loan, and was a business transaction. And the Ari may very well have reached his own conclusion, but in his saintliness, he was reluctant to rule in a lenient manner for his own benefit. In other words, he was concerned possibly his self-interest has clouded his judgment, and even though he presents a very compelling case for a lenient ruling, he still address the question to Rabbi Yosef Karo to see whether he agrees. And he did agree. And this suggestion I found in the writings of Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, contemporary rabbinic authority, who says this idea actually in the name of his son. Rabbi Yaakov Hillel says in the name of his son that this affirms the greatness of the Ari, because the Ari was in his, as I say, humility and in his fear of sin, he did not want to claim the authority on his own initiative to rule in a lenient way. Okay, we're lingering a bit on this. You see, he was married at age 15, which to us seems very young. I imagine that in that time and place, it was not exceptional, especially a young man of such extraordinary talent who is being raised by his uncle. And uncle has a daughter, by the way, so it's not surprising that they got married at a young age. Anyway, he was 15 years old. What's fascinating, again, maybe counterintuitive in terms of what we would imagine would be the career path for a great Kabbalist, he went into commerce. I told you his father was a successful, wealthy businessman, and he brought the young Yitzchak Ashkenazi, Luria Ashkenazi, brought him into the business. So he was involved in commerce, pepper and grain trading, providing, whether it was retail, wholesale, I'm not sure, import, export, that sort of thing. And it's interesting, and grain as well. What's interesting is this apparently continued even in his last years in Tzfat, even in the glory years of the Ari, when his influence became very profound within the small circle and even a wider circle as well, because apparently he had a kind of inner circle and then he had a wider circle that he taught Kabbalah at a more introductory level. But in any case, during those years as well, he apparently was still involved in business. What is fascinating to me is that the only surviving autograph document that we have from the Ari, in other words, an actual document that he himself wrote, which has survived, was discovered in the Cairo Geniza. And that document, my friends, is not a Kabbalistic formulation, and it is not words of Torah, it is not religious poetry, it is a bill of sale that he instructed when he was probably in his last days, because you'll see that he died at a young age, and he was putting his affairs in order, carrying out or giving instructions for paying or delivering, whatever it may have been. It was to do with his business activities. And as I said, there is evidence that he was maintaining that involvement even in his last days. Now, even though I say he was a businessman, he very likely was serving in Tzfat as an agent for his father-in-law. So it doesn't mean that he was, so to speak, running the business, but nevertheless, he had an involvement in commercial affairs. And as I said, this document that we have was written 3 days before his death, written and signed by the Ari himself 3 days before his death. But of course, although he was involved in commerce, that was not his main area of intellectual or interest generally. And he gradually turned to asceticism, esotericism, mysticism. Evidently, for a number of years after his marriage, he was studying, as we've mentioned with these, we have it over here in number 2, studying with Radvaz and Ashkenazi, studying Talmud, Halacha, etc., revealed Torah. But over time, he turned to asceticism, and the Zohar had just been published for the first time. It's very interesting. The Zohar, we know, is the classic, probably the most influential, earliest work of Jewish mysticism, among many, but it's probably the most important, the most well-known. It is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, as we know, who lived in the 2nd century, but the Zohar was hidden for hundreds of years. Even those who are certain that it was originated from the pen of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai recognize that it was not widely known, it was not in circulation. The average scholar even was not even familiar with it or aware of its existence. It was transmitted almost in a furtive way, in a clandestine way, generation to generation. Now, the scholars or the academics say that it was not just discovered by Moshe de Leon in the 13th century, but actually he was the one who, or maybe I think the late 12th century, but actually he was the one who composed it. I don't want to enter into that fraught subject, but it is certainly the case that even once the Zohar was more widely known after Rabbi Moshe de Leon and after it was quoted or at least referenced by Ramban and many, many others, it was still not in widespread circulation. And it was not published right away because it was, even as it remains to this very day, a text which is very difficult to understand if you just pick it up and read. It requires an initiation, it requires a mentor, someone to introduce the student, even the gifted student, into its secrets and into its deeper meaning. And therefore, it was not published immediately, but of course, nothing was published immediately in the sense that the printing press only was, Hebrew books were only first published in 1475. So perhaps it's not surprising that it was another 60, 70 years before the Zohar was printed. But when it was printed, a copy reached the hands of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, and it electrified him. He studied the Zohar to the extent that he meditated on it, he mastered it, and he made use of other esoteric texts as well. And we just continue here that from the age of 22, he had 7 years of hitbodedut seclusion on a Nile River island that was owned by his uncles. It's nice to have, again, those kinds of resources. He was married, but he would go home only for Shabbos. And when he would come home for Shabbos, he would arrive shortly before the sun set, and he would not speak to anyone, even to his wife, except as absolutely necessary, and even then in Lashon HaKodesh, in the Hebrew language. In other words, he would fulfill his responsibilities as a husband in a very, I suppose, I don't want to say minimal way, but to the extent that he felt was the right to do. But the rest of the time, the rest of his life for 7 years was devoted to this seclusion. And this was a kind of bidud, a self-imposed bidud. If you talk about self-isolation. So he was on a river island, no internet, no Amazon. Couldn't have Amazon in the Nile anyway, but it's the wrong river. No Okado. Obviously, I'm being facetious, but he lived in absolute isolation and seclusion. He wasn't only studying; he was praying, he was meditating. According to tradition, he had Gilui Eliyahu at this time as well, and he actually reached and ascended to the highest levels of spiritual attainment as a result of those years of seclusion during his time on in the Nile River in that island. As we said, he would return only on Shabbat, and even then spoke only Lashon HaKodesh. And there is a tradition about Gilui Eliyahu at that time as well. Of course, his fame became forever enshrined in Jewish memory during his time in Tzfat. So according again to this tradition, stroke legend, Eliyahu Hanavi alerted him after the 7 years, you have done your time here in Cairo, in Egypt. It's time to return to the land of your birth, the land of the destiny of the Jewish people. It seems that he went to Yerushalayim possibly for a brief time, but it seems that his Kabbalistic teachings did not have immediate resonance there. For those who were with us last week, you remember there was a lot of rivalry between Tzfat and Yerushalayim. Tzfat had become probably the most important gathering of great Torah personalities of the time, probably greater even than Yerushalayim itself. And of course, the rabbis and the sages of Yerushalayim did not take kindly to that circumstance. But Tzfat, for reasons that we'll mention in a moment, attracted, it drew many great, great personalities, many people of great creativity, great passion, great profound learning and religious aspirations, including most of them were Spanish refugees. And again, as we mentioned last week, many of those in turn, whether they came directly from Spain or they, after a generation or the generation subsequent to that, that those descendants of the Spanish exiles made their way to Tzfat. Many of them had tasted the bitter fruit of transgression. They had tasted and they felt deeply shamed by the fact whether they or their parents had even temporarily kissed the cross in order to save their lives, and they yearned for not only teshuvah, but they yearned for the rectification of the entire generation. I mentioned last week, or maybe the week before, or maybe before that, because it is a theme, literally of the theme of the 16th century, the trauma of the Spanish emigres, the trauma of the exile from Spain that left the entire generation in a state of shock. And the shock waves reverberated for generations. And of course, the best response to such a terrible trauma is to do something positive, to make something positive from it, to transform the pain and the anguish and the suffering and the grief, to transform it into something positive. And the most positive transformation, of course, would be the bringing of Mashiach. And that is why so many of those great people gravitated to the north, gravitated to Tzfat, and it would seem that the Ari was certainly one of them. Having spent a short time in Yerushalayim, he then made his way to Tzfat. We know that he was in Meron on Lag BaOmer in 1569, and actually the fact that he was in Lag BaOmer is the source for Lag BaOmer as the yortzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We are only too painfully aware in the last week and a half after the tragedy of the deaths on Lag BaOmer in Meron. So we are very conscious of the fact that this is the celebration of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the day of the yortzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It seems that the Ari was one of the first to go to Meron and to mark Lag BaOmer as the yortzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. I have to tell you that there is some evidence that it may even be based on a misprint, because in the writings of the Ari, he is said to have described Lag BaOmer as Yom Shemeis Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the day he died. But it may be a printing error, and it could be that it should have said Yom Samach Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the day of the joy of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So it's actually a bit unclear. Some have suggested that maybe it wasn't his yortzeit at all, because we don't find in earlier sources that Lag BaOmer was the day of the yortzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But we do find that the Ari says that he went and he cut his son's hair there. Maybe he was on his third birthday, again, as the minhag has developed. But the point is that Meron, the proximity of Tzfat to Meron, meant that Tzfat became a magnet for those great people who wanted to absorb the aura, the teachings, the greatness, and the sort of legacy of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. By 1570, he was in Tzfat, as you see over here, where he studied briefly under Rav Moshe Cordovero. Now, Rav Moshe Cordovero was the greatest Kabbalist in Tzfat before the Ari. We mentioned last week that Rav Moshe Al-Sheikh may have been a Talmud of Rav Moshe Cordovero, or possibly of the teacher of Rav Moshe Cordovero, who was Rav Shlomo Alkovitz, who was the brother-in-law of Rav Moshe Cordovero. Rav Moshe Cordovero is known as Ramak, and his writings, remain very influential. He wrote a sefer called Pardes Rimonim, the Orchard of Pomegranates. He wrote a sefer called, which really a Perush on the Zohar, called Or Yakar. He wrote Tomar Devora. These are available in English as well. Well, Tomar Devora is available in English as well. These are influential Kabbalistic works which are more accessible than the Kabbalah of the Ari, and maybe not quite as flashy, not quite as profound. And we'll tell a story about that shortly. So it could well be that the Ari himself went to some of the lectures of Moshe Cordovero, since he was, so to speak, the leading Kabbalist in town. But he died, Ramak died in June of that year, so it would have overlapped only very briefly. Actually, Moshe Cordovero also died at a young age. His brother-in-law, Rosh Shlomo Alkovitz, who was older than he, outlived him as well. But the Ari certainly, of course, surpassed Rosh Shlomo Alkovitz as a master of Kabbalah as well. So we've written here in number 4, the Ari succeeds and surpasses Ramak as a leading Kabbalist of Tzfat and of the generation, and indeed perhaps of all generations, according to many thinkers. I just want to mention some of his contemporaries in Tzfat, because these are the names which are or should be familiar to us. Rav Yosef Karo, of course, known as the Mechaber, the author of Shulchan Aruch. Rav Moshe Ditrani, that's Mabit, we mentioned him last week. Rav Moshe Al-Sheikh, again, we discussed in detail last week. For some reason, I've written it here as well, for some reason he was excluded from the Ari's inner circle. Difficult to know why, and we discussed in some detail last week. If you didn't tune in, you can actually get the recording, should be available in due course. Different conflicting traditions as to what extent Rav Moshe Al-Sheikh was excluded from the inner circle of the Ari, or maybe why he was excluded. But in any case, he was still in the circle of the Ari, in the wider circle of the Ari. Rabbi Yaakov Beirav was the greatest, was the eldest of all of these. Actually, the original Yaakov Beirav had already passed away by the time the Ari came to town, but his grandson also had the same name. He was also part of that circle. Rabbi Eliezer Azkiri wrote Sefer Charedim. Rabbi Eliyahu Davidas wrote Sefer Reshis Chachma. Rosh Shlomo Alkovitz we mentioned. I didn't tell you, but of course, I hope you know, he is the author of Lechadodi. That's his maybe greatest, could say, claim to fame or claim to wide name recognition. Although he wrote many Svarim and he was a very influential and respected Kabbalist in his own right. But there's no question that the Ari, in a certain way, outshone them all, with a possible exception of Rav Yosef Karo himself. I want to talk a little bit about the activities of the Ari. He was a young man when he came to Tzfat. He was born, we said, in, just checking my notes for myself, in 1534, and he arrived in Tzfat in 1570. He was in Tzfat for about 2.5 years only. He died at the age of 38. So we talk, as I said before, about a supernova that burns so brightly, and but not for very long. And it is extraordinary and quite remarkable that although his time in Tzfat was so brief, and he was such a young man at that time, his disciples include many people who were older than him. And we mentioned that Rav Moshe Al-Sheikh, who was probably 20 years older than the Ari, he asked to be admitted to his circle of Talmidim, and the request was declined even. So let's talk about his leading disciple, Rav Chaim Vital. Now, Rav Chaim Vital was an exceptionally talented young Talmid Chacham. I say young because I think he was possibly born in Tzfat, so he grew up in this great rarefied environment of Tzfat. I mean, everybody was young at one point, but what I mean to say is that his promise and his capability as a scholar were recognized early, and he became the leading, Rav Chaim Vital became the leading Talmid of Rav Moshe Al-Sheikh. Rav Moshe Al-Sheikh gave smicha to Rav Chaim Vital. And yet, at the same time, Rav Chaim Vital also became a Talmid of the Ari. So Ramosha Al-Sheikh was his mentor in matters of halacha and in medrash and in drush, no doubt, but his mentor in Kabbalistic matters, in esoterica, in the secrets of the Torah, was the Ari, to the point that Reb Chaim Vital became by far the most important disciple of the Ari, and I even used the term on one occasion, the amanuensis of the Ari. He became like the scribe of the Ari. We mentioned that the Ari, oh, let me not mention, I may mention it somewhere else in another time and place, so forgive me. But the Ari, he was like a wellspring that surged forth with wisdom and with creativity continuously. He never wrote down any notes. He never spoke from notes. And once he started addressing a topic, it's like a torrent was unleashed. And the Talmidim would pay attention, would listen and glean as much as they could, try to write down what they could. It was Reb Chaim Vital who was the leading disciple, the leading scribe of the Ari. And nearly all of the teachings of the Ari that have come down to us come through Reb Chaim Vital. So before the Ari came to town, or maybe even after he came to town, for a while, Rav Chaim Vital was a Talmud of Rav Moshe Cordovero. As we said, Moshe Cordovero was the leading Kabbalist in Tzfat at that time. On one occasion, the Ari went with him, according to this legend, the Ari went with Rav Chaim Vital for a little trip. They took a day trip. Perhaps in those days it was longer than a day trip, from Tzfat down to the Kinneret, the Yam Kinneret, which you can see from Tzfat actually. And they went down to Yam Kinneret, and they went down in a boat. At a certain point in the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Galilee, they put down the anchor, and the Ari put his cup into the water, and he said to the Reb Chaim Vital, "Drink this water." The water at this point here in the Yam Kinneret derives or has admixed within it some of the water of the wellspring of Miriam. When you drink this water, you will be able to begin to understand my teachings. The teachings of Rav Moshe Cordovero, I said, were and remain more accessible. The teachings of the Ari transcend human understanding. I'm not saying that every idea that he has expressed is beyond anyone's grasp, but the more profound, it's like an iceberg of which you can see part of it, but most of it is beyond the comprehension. Said the Ari, if you drink this water, you will begin to appreciate and grasp ideas which transcend human understanding. The association of that with Miriam we'll have to say for another time. He identified the grave sites of many prophets, of Tanaim and Amoraim, through Gilui Eliyahu. Eliyahu Hanavi would help him to identify who is buried where. And when one visits the Galil, even today, you can, I'm sure there are apps now that are available that will show you all the grave sites which have been designated and in the Galil, and those are all from the Ari. He's the one who indicated and revealed where those various important personalities are buried. So in the letter C here, he wrote almost nothing. A few poems. He wrote Askinu Sudasa. If you sing it, Sudash Shishit or other Shabbos meals, Askinu Sudasa Dimehemenusa, this is written by the Ari himself. But in terms of commentaries, original monographs, etc., he did not record anything. They were recorded by Reb Chaim Vital and some others as well, especially in a book called Eitz Chaim in 8 volumes. Other sources are Shivchei Ha'ari, Shulchan Aruch Ha'ari. What's fascinating is that initially, and this was true for I think about 100 years, his writings were not allowed to circulate outside of the land of Israel. Even the Talmidim were like sworn to secrecy, that they would not, so to speak, make them widely available, to give it to a scribe, to make another copy and send it to colleagues somewhere else. And for decades, maybe generations, it was not available in Europe. Finally, in 1662, it was printed. The writings of Reb Chaim Vital, and printed by a man named Isaac Satanov. Did I say 16? I think it was 1772. 1772, it was printed for the first time. So for a long time, it was never printed. Now it's been printed and reprinted many, many times. But even before it was printed, in manuscript form, the writings of the Ari kind of began to seep out, and the writings of Reb Chaim Vital with the teachings of the Ari. And okay, we said, just to finish up in terms of his life, he died in an epidemic at the age of 38 on the 5th of Av, 25 July, 1572. Let's talk briefly about his teachings. Profound, novel, creative, known as Lurianic Kabbalah. He introduces us to concepts such as Tzimtzum, Shriat HaKelim, Tikkun, the idea of rectifying the world, rectifying the soul. Of course, the idea of Gilgul Nishamot. Rav Chaim Vital has a whole book about the teachings of the Ari regarding who is a Gilgul of whom, what souls were reincarnated from biblical personalities to later personalities, even contemporaries as well. I think we mentioned last week that Rav Chaim Vital said that Rav Moshe Alshech was a Gilgul of Chutzpis Hamaturgaman, and then he became also of Ravina. He was a Gilgul of Ravina, who was the editor of the Gemara. Also ideas like the Nitzotzos Hakedoshim, Hakedusha, sparks of holiness, redeeming the sparks. If you've heard of these concepts, they all originate with the Ari. Someone like Rabbi Chaim Ibn Attar, or HaChaim, again, helps to very greatly popularize many of the simpler teachings, or let's say the profound teachings, but in an accessible way of the Ari, are found in the writings of the Or HaChaim al HaTorah, Chida that I mentioned also, but many, many other sources. What is interesting is that when you just scroll down a bit further, and I hope to spend a few minutes still just to read you a few excerpts in a greatly simplified English rendition of the writings of Rav Chaim Vital about the teachings of the Ari. We'll get to that very shortly. So let's look at influence. So what is commonly known as Nusach Sfard, you go into a shul or into a Sfarim store and you look at a Siddur, and it says on a Nusach Sfard, or somebody says, I daven Nusach Sfard. And this fellow his heritage seems to come from Poland, doesn't seem to be Spanish at all, or Mizrahi in any way. What is colloquially known today as Nusach Sfard is adapted from the writings and the nusach of the prayer style of the Ari. The Hasidim in Poland in the early 18th century, who wanted to incorporate some of the Kabbalistic teachings of the Ari, not just the teachings, but some of his style of prayer, some of his own prayers and that sort of thing with the Kabbalistic associations. So they adapted the Siddur that had been in use in Ashkenazi lands for hundreds of years, and it became known as Nusach Sfard, Nusach Sfard, because it was adapted from the Nusach of the Sfardim, but its real origins, in other words, the main influence that they sought to incorporate was the influence of the Ari. You probably know there's something called Nusach Ari, Chabad, what they daven their Nusach, they call it Nusach Ari. It's not the true Nusach Ari, but it also is influenced by the Ari because everybody wants the stardust of the Ari. There's something called Kitav Ari. That's a style of writing Hebrew. So a sofer will write as a mezuzah or a Sefer Torah or Tefillin in Kitav Ari. And Sephardim, Hasidim, others of Kabbalistic inclinations, that's what they want. They want the writing of Kitav Ari. The Magen Avraham, one of the most influential classic commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Abraham Gombiner, lived in Poland, you see his dates there, was the first to introduce into halachic discourse in a widely dispersed manner the teachings of the Ari. The Magen Avraham quotes the Ari frequently, and he generally will cite the Ari in an authoritative manner. In other words, the ruling or the minhag or the practice of the Ari has acquired through the Magen Avraham and other sources an enormous amount of influence. And I'd like to share with you an insight which only came to me recently, and I think it's a simple but actually very compelling observation. When we think about the Jewish religion as we observe it today, anyone who wants to keep the mitzvahs of the Torah, so in many respects, an educated person knows what to do. He knows how we lead our lives in accordance with Torah law. If you were to say to him or her, for that matter, this halacha that you do in this particular way, where is it written? So even if I'm not expert in the Shulchan Aruch, I would know enough to say, well, it probably comes from the Shulchan Aruch. It's written in the Shulchan Aruch, and many times it is. Or I might say the Mishnah Brura, which is a very influential, important commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. But the classic source, I would say, the Shulchan Aruch, or the Beis Yosef, or the Tur, or the Rambam, Mishnah Torah, or the Rif. But the interesting thing is that all of those sources are built on the Talmud. If the Rambam had not written the Mishnah Torah, even if Rav Yosef Karo had not written the Shulchan Aruch, our practice of Jewish observance would probably be very similar to what it is, because it's based on the Talmud anyway. So if Rav Yosef Karo had not written the Shulchan Aruch, another authority would have written, and many other authorities have written, halachic compendia based ultimately on the Talmud. Here is the novelty. The Ari probably exercises more original influence on Jewish practice than the Rambam or the Rif or the Shulchan Aruch or the Tur, because all of those are ultimately derived from the Talmud. The Ari is not necessarily derived from the Talmud. The Ari, the teachings of the Ari, the practices of the Ari, the personal observances, in some cases the personal stringencies of the Ari derive either from the Zohar or frequently from other Kabbalistic sources which we don't even know. And maybe the Ari himself did not derive it from anything that he saw, but from his own creative, profound understanding of the practice or the meaning of Jewish life. My point is, excuse me, that many of the minhagim of Jewish practice, without even realizing it, come from the Ari. Excuse me, to a very great extent. I'll just mention finally, and then we'll do a few short excerpts. Popularity of Kabbalah is part of his influence. The fact that Kabbalah in the Hasidic world, since the days of the Baal Shem Tov in the early 1700s, certainly in the Sephardic world to a very great extent, the teachings of the Ari have such enormous influence. Also, on the possibly the debit part of the ledger is Shabtai Tzvi, the catastrophic debacle of the false Messiah of Shabtai Tzvi built the fervor, and he himself drew on the teachings of the Ari and the messianic agitation that followed in the wake of the teachings of the Ari as well. The reason that Kabbalah was so popular, not the only reason, but part of the reason it was so popular, as I said before, is because of the yearning for Messiah, the feeling that it's only through the esoteric teachings of the Torah, when the secrets of the Torah are studied and appreciated and revealed, when that which has been hidden for centuries has been uncovered and has been accessed, that will precipitate the arrival of Mashiach. And certainly the rise of the Hasidic movement owes a great deal to the legacy of the Ari. I would like to take another few minutes, in the last minutes we have left, to read you a few excerpts, and I don't think I've got the scale. We were trying to get it together before. Sure, it's very easy to do, but I'm not quite sure I've got the skill at the moment to call it up on the screen. I'll just read you a few short excerpts from the writings of Rav Chaim Vital that derive directly from the teachings of the Ari. So here's something about the ways of prayer. It is wrong for a person to pray in a state of depression, but one is rather to pray in the manner of a servant who serves his master in joy. Otherwise, the soul will be unable to receive the higher illumination through his prayer. Only when reciting the confessional of sin or when recalling his own sins is this permitted. In other words, to feel a sense of not despondency, but to be sort of dejected in prayer. But when reciting the other prayer, not when reciting that prayer, submissiveness is in order, but it is to be expressed with great joy. Here's another one. My teacher used to say that it is desirable for a person to consider himself the dwelling place and seat of the divine emanations, for man is made in the divine image. This is especially important during prayer. Through this, his prayer will rise and be accepted, etc. My teacher never raised his voice when reciting his prayers, not even the part of the service which is well established, like the Psalm of Praise, to show submissiveness before God. Only on the Sabbath did he raise his voice slightly in honor of the Sabbath. He says that he would always recite the prayers from a text, not orally, even though I'm sure he knew it all by heart. He would, the parts of prayer that are quoted from the Mishnah, he would recite with a melody, like Vane Madlikin or Ezuhu Mekomen Shel Zvachim. He would recite them in the nigun of learning Torah. The Mishnah actually brings that as well. Before entering the synagogue, a person is to take on himself the positive commandment, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. For those who come to Kesher, we have in our Sidurim a book plate that has that reminder as well, that a person should accept upon himself the mitzvah of loving his fellow man, and in that way he may merit to evoke the divine favor and the divine love as well. He's directed his heart to love everyone among the people of Israel as himself. Thereby his prayers will ascend, comprehending within itself all the people of Israel. It will be able to rise and be endowed with potency. If I identify with you, with my neighbor, with even a stranger, all members of the Jewish people, then my prayers gain the potency of the prayers of all of Klal Yisrael. Okay, this is a teaching of the Ari. It was the practice of my teacher to recite in his prayer all the particularizations of sin as found in the confessional prayer, even though they did not apply to him. So he did not exclude from mentioning sins of which he was not guilty. Again, it's the idea of identifying with the rest of Klal Yisrael. Okay, I'll just read one last excerpt. I noted my teacher was not particular about the clothes he wore. He used to eat little. Expenditures to meet his wife's needs he extended to her according to her wishes. He used to give charity with a glad heart and an open hand. At times he did not consider whether he was left with any funds for himself or not. My teacher also used to say that each mitzvah has its own letter among the 22 letters of the Aleph base, and when a person performs a mitzvah, that letter shines on his forehead, and then it is absorbed within. But if he performed the mitzvah of charity, the letter pertaining to it, that's the tzadi, obviously, does not recede quickly like the letters of the other precepts, but remains on his forehead all week long, illustrating the secret meaning of the verse, and his righteousness, tzidkaso omedes la'ad. His charity will endure forever. So the interpretation here is that a person who gives tzedakah, so the tzadi on his forehead would remain apparent. They say that the Ari had the capacity to peer into a person's, whether his eyes or even look at his forehead, and to see what his activities were, what his thoughts are. They say that when a person would go to the Ari, he would put his hat over his forehead, so the Ari wouldn't be able to see him too closely and realize what his thoughts are, what he's been up to, and that sort of thing. I didn't read it, but the Chaim Vital describes how the Ari had the capacity to understand, to comprehend, to appreciate, to know the future, to know events happening far away. He describes him and he insists these are not things which I heard or by way of tradition, these are things which I observed with my own eyes. So just in summary, the Ari is one of those remarkable I wouldn't say once in a generation, but really once in human history, such a person appears whose greatness, whose influence, whose creativity, whose novel contribution, and whose discovery of the most profound and esoteric secrets of Jewish tradition or of existence itself comes to the fore. And the fact that he revealed as much as he did within the short time available is clearly something that is part of the divine plan. And as I said, we continue to, in a way, derive nourishment from the teachings and the legacy of the Ari Haloki Rabbeinu Yitzchak. Thank you to everyone for listening. And we're just about over our 60-minute threshold, but in accordance with Neil's earlier comments, if there are any questions or contributions, I'm happy to consider them. Just to say that next week is going to be Shavuot, so we're not in session next week, but the week after, we will be doing the finale in our 5-week series, and that is the Maharal of Prague. Maharal of Prague will conclude our studies of selected sages of the 16th century. But any thoughts about Ari? I'm happy to take them or consider them. Rakasha.
Okay, Rabbi, thank you once again for another wonderful and illuminating evening on this great Torah personality. And we look forward to 2 weeks' time. And in the meantime, thank you and good evening.
Yeah, thank you. Chag Sameach to everyone, and hopefully we'll hear only good news from Israel. It's weighing on me, and I'm sure that all of us as well tonight. Hopefully only good news in the days to come. And I wish you Chag Sameach, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time from Maharaj.